first of all, what is forensics? How do you define that term? What are we even talking about here? The way that I think of forensics is the application of a legal perspective to the domains of science and technology. It's really very broadly defined in that sense. But generally the purpose or the outcome of taking a forensic perspective is to have information that can be used for legal purposes, if you will. When you use forensic tools, you're sort of looking at it from, the COVID perspective or the auditor perspective as balancing on the reactive, the detective side of the balance of the control equation. And obviously the other counterbalance is proactive control. I'm not going to talk about proactive controls today. In terms of reactive controls, forensic tools can be considered from several different perspectives. I think I'm going to come at this from a little bit different angle, which is just getting a little more context, looking at some of the regulatory issues very, very quickly. We've only got 10 minutes on this area. Things around outsourcing and having a forensic investigation capability for your organization. And then very, very quickly, 2 miles wide, 3 inches deep, how do you develop that capability internally? And we can go 1,000 hours on that one subject, but just to give you a quick taste of it. I've got some training in forensics circa 1999, certified forensic something, but it's become a very small part of my professional life. But I think it's enough at least to give you a high-level view of what it takes to build up that capability. A couple of facts, right? A couple of pieces of reality we have to face are, one, a company can't prevent every bad thing from happening, right? You can decide what you want to focus on, what vulnerabilities you want to minimize, but you can't pick everything. It's too expensive, it's too illogical, and as business people, that might not be the best business logic in terms of making investments in your risk management program. The other piece of it, I think, is that we choose a lot of our incidents. We choose the subjects that we're going to have to do investigations on because we decide what vulnerabilities we're going to fix, what vulnerabilities we're going to de-emphasize. And those eventually can lead to the sore points or the weaknesses that need the reactive measures later on. So you're choosing which piece of the equation you're going to balance, and it's really ultimately a question of time. And there's several different dimensions of time. I mean, time and the concept of time is so central to the subject of forensics from two different swatches here. One is, when do you want to deal with the complexities of your environment, right? So you can do architecture, you can deal with proactively designing controls into your systems, or you can wait later or hope later that some things won't go wrong. But really the art and the capacity of a security architect to design a system and have balanced controls is equilibrium with the same set of skills to do root cause analysis and use forensics tools to figure out what the story was when something went out of bounds, when you had an incident, by whatever definition you define an incident. And when you look at the investigative process, time is so vitally important in terms of keeping track of what happened when, figuring out a real timeline for investigation is central to having a successful outcome, however you want to define that. But if you can't figure out what a timeline was, if you don't have reliable data points, logs, etc., your investigative effort has exponentially increased in its difficulty and complexity. That's probably another central point around e-discovery, and that's another subject I think we won't go deep into today, but you really need to have a perspective on what elements of time are going to be important in your investigation. The one rule of thumb to start with is document everything now. Every single detail you can capture at the moment is going to support any case you're trying to build. I assume when you're taking efforts to do some type of forensic investigation, you're building a case. If not, what are you doing? What type of information are you trying to create, and how do you want to use that in your business? There's other legitimate reasons, but I think having a case is probably the first and foremost priority for most of us. If you consider different perspectives, think about a case and all the folks that you'll interact with and the way that you'll do an investigation as a person, right? And that interaction and your role in that experience, I think you can put on a couple of different hats. One, you can say I'm a reporter, or I'm an investigative journalist, I'm a foreign correspondent in this unknown culture, right? Or the other way to think of it, and this is germane to my background, I grew up in New York City as a New York street thug. And this was a conversation I had with the American Bar Association's Information Security Committee, which I think was helpful to them in this book they're actually working on right now around e-discovery. These interactions, right, when you're trying to build a case, and there's a great deal of training that goes into being a good investigator, right? You can't be a good technologist and then pick up some tips on being an investigator. Investigation is an art form as much as a science. But when you're doing these things, you know, think of it as this is your case, and your case is going to be a little bit defensive. You know, when you're looking for questions, when you're looking for data, you'll get responses, you know, soprano-like responses. Who wants to know? Who's asking? What's the information work for you? Right? That's very much the nature of an investigation. Things don't sort of flow easily or quickly in many cases. You have to really want information, and you have to have the motivation to follow through on getting real data that may be valid and discerning what may not be useful in a case. So we talked about forensics as science and technology in a legal context. There's a lot of things we can do and investigate constantly. You have to have that end objective. If you're not planning to take a case to prosecution, you know, when do you cut your losses? Do you even choose to put the effort into discovery of something that really is not going to change your behavior? Figure out if you really need something and if that's going to change what the outcome is, and if it's a cause and effect relationship, or if there's going to be no effect at all. The other way to look at it is from a balance of forensic capability with intelligence, with corporate intelligence. However you want to define that. It's the ability of an organization to use data in a way that transforms it into information to make smart decisions. Think about how the data that you collect will be used. What are you going to do with it? Right? If I tell you this, what are you going to do with it? Like, you have to have answers to those tough questions very early on. And you have to sort of have that motivation that there's an end point, there's an end game to this. Superior intelligence drives a more efficacious response, right? Efficacious, effective, and efficient. So you're collecting intelligence through an investigation. This is the reactive collection of intelligence versus, there's also opportunities to proactively create intelligence. And in either case, the more intelligence you have that's germane to what you're investigating, the more effective response capability you have. It fits into a bigger picture. Forensics is never a subject in its own right. It's not a security profession. It doesn't fit into one specialized area without other areas supporting it, without audit, without security management supporting it. It's not a standalone subject. It's especially important to capitalize on learning opportunities as you go. No one's seen every case. There's always something new in everything that you come across. And sort of taking that attitude, because honestly, this stuff is quite frustrating. I've chosen to wear the security architect hat much more often than the examiner hat because I get to build stuff and I get to take credit for it, and it's a little more fun. It's very frustrating. It's very rewarding to do investigations as well, but keep a stiff upper lip sometimes and say, no matter what the outcome, I learned something that will make me better next time. A lot of cases aren't going to end the way that you'd like them to. In either case, forensics and intelligence function in your organization need to be managed to obtain optimal value and make sure that your incident response capability is as robust as you expect it to be. The other way to look at it is being prepared to be a storyteller. And from that standpoint, you want to have an investigative workflow and tools that can help you create the screenplay that you were planning to create from the beginning. If you don't know what kind of story you're going to end up with, you're shooting in the dark. By the end of the investigative process, you should know what the report format is that you plan to use, what data and levels of detail you plan to collect, and what's going to be enough to take the investigation to the next level that you had intended. The other piece of it is using data to drive an investigation. Using data, making data-driven decisions in any aspect of security management, right? But are you going to use data points, or have you come to a conclusion? What are your preconceived ideas around an incident that are going to make you a less effective investigator? How can you be objective? How can you build a team that creates greater objectivity in an investigation? One way to do that is to understand and consider things from the perspective of the control objectives of the organization. Right? So strategically, you've got a mission, you've got your corporate vision, you've got specific goals and objectives, and the control objectives will help you to make a decision about what time and what energy to spend on certain types of investigations. Granted, when you start something, it's just going to be a blip on the radar screen, and you don't know what direction it might go. But once you sort of figure out what the amorphous shape is of an investigation you've started, you can decide if it's important based on what were the original strategic objectives of the organization. And then also, when you put time and energy into something, does it actually improve the corporate capacity for competitive intelligence, for corporate intelligence? That might be an investment of time and energy that pays off in other dimensions. And can we jump to the next slide? So again, you want to architect your corporate infrastructure to support monitoring and investigative requirements, right? If you know your control objectives and you want to be able to investigate certain types of things, you build for it ahead of time, or you suffer through it later on and you react, and the probability of successful cases is much less. So here's a couple of different potential scenarios. These are the things you're most likely going to come across. I think just from a slightly different perspective, the types of investigations that you typically handle. Different scenarios or pain points. And a lot of these have sort of an HR dimension to them. But it could be transmission and storage of damaging information to the organization or to a partner. It could be transmission and storage of messages that support claims for defamation, for harassment, for insider training, or for wrongful discharge. Disclosure of confidential information to outsiders, that's what we focused on primarily. That's what I've spent a good deal of time focusing on, not only from the investigative standpoint, but from building proactive controls and measures to balance that as well. Access to systems by competitors or third parties. Lack of system for organizing, retaining, and destroying electronic data. And to complement that, incomplete deletion or destruction of electronic data. So if you are the recipient of third-party data and you certify that you've destroyed it and tell your partner that, and that's not a really reliable statement, that's a great deal of liability. There's going to be an investigation on both sides, right? You may have an internal control problem, and from the other side, there's going to potentially be an external investigation. Those are the types of things you need to anticipate. It's very likely for most organizations that that's one that you might trip over eventually. And then unauthorized installation or copying of copyrighted materials. The Business Software Alliance has made a mission to find those things, and anyone can pick up the phone and give just cause to be investigated for misusing software licenses in the organization. And then unauthorized employee use of security to block company access. So this could be denial of service, this could be the insider dimension of that as well. Let's jump over the privacy stuff. There's an element of that in what we're talking about here, but it's a whole other topic. The key thing around privacy is that having a password in place, having a security control in place is not privacy. That's a foundation by which you can create a process that supports your privacy objectives. The key thing around e-discovery is that you've got a good relationship between the risk management function in your organization and the legal function. And it's very important to be aware of what folks' legal training is, what their legal capacity is. And so I'm not going to touch much on legal stuff. I can talk about a lot of laws that I'm familiar with, but I'm not expert in it, right? I know to be aware of them. I know to get help on those things when something comes up. And then some of the solutions, right? So from a high level, right, having the right policies in place, having an understanding and preparation around data retention is especially important. And then from the employee HR perspective, if you want to be able to monitor folks, if you want to be able to collect data, there's a lot of laws around employee monitoring, right? So very clearly establishing early on an expectation of privacy, what's monitored regularly, having new employees sign off on statements acknowledging that puts you in a much better position to gather information and use it when you're ready. At the same time, you can't be draconian, right? So you have to know how far do you want to go with your intelligence capability and how far that can support your investigative capability later on. Next slide. Okay, so when you build an investigative team, right, again, this is the alliance between the risk management function, the security folks, and the legal folks. That is central to having forensic capability. It's the marriage of technology and a legal perspective. So you could probably, if you had one singular measure of the potential success of an investigation or your internal forensic capability, it would be some gauge of that relationship. That's a very good indicator of how strong your company is in its preparation to investigate any type of incident.